Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Press Club for our book event featuring former Attorney General Eric Holder and best-selling author Sam Koppelman. I'm Mike Balsamo, lead justice and law enforcement reporter for the Associated Press and National Press Club secretary. We are looking forward to a robust discussion today and are happy to take your questions as well from the audience. If you have a question, please write them on the cards on your seat, and you can hand them to Kate right there in the back. 2022 may be the year of the gerrymander. States are grappling with population shifts after the 2020 census, and that means legislatures are in the throes of redrawing election maps. Groups on both sides of the aisle have called foul and are taking their cases to the courts. Judges have thrown out Republican-drawn redistricting maps in Ohio, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, and Democratic-drawn maps in New York and Maryland. Republicans have called Democrats' strategy "sue until it's blue." Democrats have called the Republican efforts undemocratic, radically motivated gerrymandering that intends to suppress the votes of minorities and young people. Our guests today have been at the center of this battle for voting rights for years. As Attorney General in the Obama administration, Eric Holder placed voting rights at the top of his agenda and was an outspoken critic of voter ID laws. Now he chairs the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and with best-selling author Sam Koppelman, the former director of surrogate speechwriting on the Biden-Harris campaign, has written Our Unfinished March, The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of the Vote, A History, a Crisis, a Plan. The book explores the oftentimes harsh history of the vote, its place at the core of democracy, and its vulnerability. The Voter Rights Act has been under assault since it was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, with the latest salvo coming in 2013 with a landmark ruling in Shelby v. Holder that struck down the section of the law that required some jurisdictions with a history of voter suppression to seek approval from the Justice Department before enacting changes to existing voter laws and procedures. Since then, many states have passed laws restricting the vote. We're delighted to have with us today both Attorney General Holder and Mr. Koppelman to discuss the book and the state of the vote. Gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club. And with that, Attorney General Holder, the podium is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for that kind introduction. Thanks for having me here. I haven't been to the press club in quite some time. I'm excited to talk about our new book, Our Unfinished March, and also to talk about our ongoing and continuing fight to save our democracy. So let's start here. Our country has achieved, I think, once inconceivable progress over the course of the life of this nation, and certainly over the course of these last few decades. We elected the first black president and the first black vice president. We have confirmed the first black woman who will sit on the United States Supreme Court. I was the first black attorney general of the United States. I mean, just one generation after my father was told to leave a whites-only train car while wearing the United States Army uniform during the course of World War II, his son was able to serve as Attorney General of the United States. And that's something. That's progress. Now, that's progress that my parents and generations before would never have imagined, but we need to be extremely clear. That progress did not simply arrive. It was won by those who confronted forces of injustice throughout the history of this nation to make America a better, more equal, and more fair place. It was built by individuals who we talk about in the book, who were committed to our highest ideals. And it was achieved, as it always has been, in the midst of unrelenting and escalating attempts to fight against democracy and against democratic ideals. You know, for as long as America has existed, two opposing forces have clashed over how we express and how we confer the rights and privileges of citizenship. From the founding to slavery to abolition, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow, those who sought a more inclusive nation have been countered by those who were determined to maintain power at the expense of others. Anti-democracy forces use property and poll taxes and literacy tests, intimidation, and outright violence to achieve their goals. And even after landmark civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation were signed into law, these forces found ways to undermine and to ignore the freedoms that America promised to all of its citizens. Now, I saw these threats up close as Attorney General of the United States. Photo ID laws aimed at suppressing the votes of young people and people of color, voter roll purges that delete millions of eligible voters' names, disproportionately impacting minority communities, polling place closures, and consolidations that vastly increase wait times in minority neighborhoods. Gerrymanders designed with surgical precision to dilute and diminish the voting power of Black and brown Americans. Now, these measures were never spontaneous, emotional responses from dispossessed individuals or sporadic efforts to improve election security. Instead, they have been part of a highly strategic, well-funded campaign fueled by powerful interests committed to gutting our democracy. Now, it's a campaign that has only intensified in recent years. Since the day of the last presidential election, lawmakers across the country have introduced more than 400 restrictive election bills in 49 states and passing more than 30 in at least 19 states. Our institutions have been wounded, damaged by a president who spent 4 years abusing his power, and by insurrectionists and their allies who are working to do in state legislatures what they could not do at the Capitol on January the 6th. We are facing an attack on the right to vote not seen since the Jim Crow era. And the question is, what do we do now? Sam and I wrote this book to answer that question in particular, to give you a sense of our history, to give you a sense of the nature of the problem that we confront today, and also to provide some concrete solutions about what do we do next. To provide that larger context for the brutal, bloody, and at times hopeful history of the fight to voting rights, we talked about the history. To show what it looks like to wage a successful battle for democracy, we talk about certain individuals and elevate them, bring them back into the consciousness of people in this country. And to propose a policy playbook for how we can reverse the tides of voter suppression and renew the American experiment, we have specific ideas about things that we ought to consider. And a lot of people have reacted and said, well, you know, you're talking about things that sound too expansive, too big for this nation to do. But that's what defines this country at its best. When we do big, the Great Society, that was big. The New Frontier, the ideas there, that was big. The New Deal, that was big. Eisenhower's successful attempt to build the interstate highway system, that was big. This nation does big. This nation does hard. That is what makes us exceptional. And we need leaders who will think big again and then lead this nation in really substantial ways. The playbook that we talk about includes really two vital categories. First, we have to fix our elections through policies that are guided by one key principle, and that is making it easier to vote. If the United States is going to truly be a representative democracy, then it needs to represent all of our citizens, and that means all of our citizens need to be able to use their voice, and the way that they use their voice is through the vote. No matter who you are, what you look like, where you live, or how many hours you can afford to spend waiting in line, if you are an eligible voter, we must not only allow you to vote, we have to make it easy for you to vote. Think about it. That sounds like a kind of a no-brainer. There are actually people who have said that we should not make it easier to vote. We should make it harder to vote. Test people to see whether or not they really want to overcome obstacles in order to cast a ballot. Every eligible voter deserves a fair, equal, and meaningful opportunity to make their voice heard. That is what we say in our book. Second, we need to reform our institutions, the bedrock of our democracy. And that's no small task, because right now most of our institutions are geared toward maintaining an unjust status quo. We have an unnecessary and anti-democratic Electoral College that reversed the people's vote in 40% of presidential elections over the past 2 decades. We have a stolen Supreme Court that has gutted landmark civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation, with more of our fundamental freedoms hanging in the balance. That leaked opinion gives us a sense of where this new court is about to go. We have a warped Senate that concentrates too much power in the hands of an extreme minority of the population. We need to reimagine these institutions so that they live up to their ideals, to ensure that every person has a fair say in the direction of our democracy. I mean, even the House of Representatives, what the founders envisioned as the people's house, is plagued by gerrymandering that locks extreme politicians in and shuts American voters out. The congressional map is as close to even as it has been in a generation, the maps that we have just about finished drawing. And yet the number of competitive seats in the United States House of Representatives is at a historic low. People of color continue to be denied fair representation. Now, some of the ideas that we lay out in our book may sound, as I said, radical, but I have seen enough as a prosecutor, as a judge, and also as Attorney General to know that fundamental change is necessary and that fundamental change is possible. I've seen enough, not just in my career, but also in my lifetime as a black man in this country, to know that change, in fact, is possible. And I'm confident that even today that we have the power to unleash the promise of our democracy and live up to the values that we all say that we hold dear. And that's what this book is about, to show you how we can channel the courage of foot soldiers for democracy who came before us, build on that legacy in this new century, and take America to the place where we all want it to be. You know, because the truth is that the success or failure of our democracy isn't up to me. It's not up to an attorney general. It's not up to the government. It's up to all of us. Every one of us has to stand up for our ideals. Every one of us has to speak out for ourselves and also for each other. Every one of us must recognize our obligations, embrace our power, and act with clarity and purpose, even and especially when it's hard, when it seems like it can't be done. That's the way to make change in this country. That's the way we have made change in this country in the past. I think this country is up to doing it once again. So I want to thank you for inviting us to be here today, and we look forward to interacting with all of you with any questions that you might want to ask. Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen. I wanted to start with some recent news. So yesterday, a Florida judge struck down parts of Governor Ron DeSantis' congressional district map as unconstitutional. The map dispersed 367,000, African-American voters among 4 different districts, a clear attempt to dilute black voting power and creating a majority-safe Republican districts. DeSantis says he will appeal. So can you, General, give us your analysis of the situation in Florida, which has obviously traditionally been a swing state?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you have to put this in context. Ron DeSantis said that what the Florida legislature was intending to do, the Republicans in the Florida legislature were intending to do, which is a pretty bad gerrymander, didn't go far enough. And so he said, I would veto that which the Republican legislature was going to do as not going far enough. I'm going to veto that. And they caved in and passed that which he proposed. A judge has now said that given the situation in Florida, there's an amendment to the Florida Constitution that requires redistricting to be done on a nonpartisan basis. A judge has said that what the governor has proposed, or the legislature has put into effect, is in fact inappropriate. It has a particularly negative impact on African American voters in the northern part of Florida. And it's something that we've seen Republicans do in the present day. Maybe Sam can talk about the situation we describe in the book in North Carolina. But it is typical of the problem that we have to call out, typical of the problem that we have to confront. You know, too many Republicans are afraid of the people who they say they want to represent. You know, they want to pick their own voters as opposed to letting citizens choose who their representatives ought to be. And I don't know, Sam, maybe talk about what happened in North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, in the book we write about this student named Love Caesar who was at College of North Carolina. They'd split the university, the historically black college, in half. And she explained to her classmates that what they were doing was silencing their voices, erasing the power of their votes. And so she went outside in the middle of the night with chalk and drew a line down the middle of campus to show how their power was being divided, how it was being attacked. And it led to all sorts of outraged. People came together, protested, and with the help of the Attorney General's organization, the NDRC, those maps ended up being thrown out. It was a moment where Republicans, the folks who drew the maps, thought they could get away with silent, intentional, bureaucratic silencing of votes. And because the people responded, those in power were forced to pay attention. So you can overcome this gerrymandering. And it's not just a situation where it hurts our democracy because it makes it so certain voices have more power than others. The other thing gerrymandering does is it makes districts way less competitive by basically making it so there's blowout elections. People are more worried about primaries than they are about the general election. And that's how you end up having bills like the ones that make their way through state legislatures that ban access to choice because the people who pass them know they're not actually going to be held accountable by the majorities that oppose that kind of legislation. And so the only way you're actually going to get representatives who represent you is by speaking up, speaking out, and protesting those kinds of maps and getting them thrown out in the courts. I mean, you look at sort of the radicalization of these state legislatures, the same ones that then suppress the vote to make it harder for you to vote in the future, to make it easier to get gerrymandered in the future. And you enter this democratic doom loop where the people who are getting elected by minorities end up passing laws that increase minority rule, that make it harder and harder and harder to undo that power. It's how you end up with these laws. It's how you end up with representatives like Madison Cawthorn ending up in Congress, truly crazy people who would never otherwise win. And that's the reason that we have to combat them and lead a real
And I think
rebellion.
the important thing about Love Caesar, is that, and I went down to North Carolina A&T, which is the largest African-American, historically black college university in the country. They split that college. They split the campus. Half the black kids here, half the black kids in another congressional district, simply to weaken their power, because taken together, they were a pretty formidable force. So they split them. That's called cracking. Sometimes you pack people together. But that also shows the power of the individual, this notion that, we can't do this. The problems are too big. A young African-American woman named Love Caesar with a piece of chalk, drew that line, exactly where the line had been drawn by the legislature to demonstrate to the students there and to the larger public what actually was going on. We used that data point in our lawsuit and had a judge throw those maps out. The judges, we brought these cases before. One of them described what the Republicans had done there as having drawn discriminatory lines with surgical precision, surgical precision, splitting up a campus. You wake up in one congressional district in a dorm, you go to a class in another congressional district. I mean, you think about that. That's what has been done in too many places, but also think about the power of an individual to have an impact in changing that situation.
Thank you. General, you wrote in a column for Time that the Supreme Court's mission had been compromised and that the institution is in need of reform. You cited specifically Shelby, the case that gutted the Voting Rights Act, as the moment that made you realize the court was facing a modern-day existential crisis. What disturbed you particularly about Shelby?
Well, first, that my name is on it. It's like, you called it right. I call it the Shelby County case. I never say Shelby County versus my name. I don't want to be associated with that case. I mean, again, we talk about this in the book. That is, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It is the thing that fundamentally changed politics in this nation. You look at the before and after number of African American representatives at the state, local, and federal level, people of color. You see a huge increase in the number of African Americans who actually registered to vote. African American power, so long suppressed, was unleashed after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the Shelby County case, Chief Justice Roberts says that America has changed. All right, and I wouldn't dispute that. I would not dispute that. But he thinks America, in his opinion, thought America has changed so much there was no longer a need, in essence, I mean, there's some, go through the particulars, but in essence for an effective Voting Rights Act. And as we note in the book, you saw not years later, weeks later, but hours later, you saw states around the country putting in place voter suppression measures that would have been prohibited had the act stayed intact. And that has had a negative impact on our democracy from the day of that decision up to the present. I actually think that there's a trio of cases that the Supreme Court has rendered that will stand the Roberts Court. It will not show the Roberts Court in a good way. Citizens United, which allowed the free flow of money into our system, the Shelby County case in 2013, and then the Rucho case, where the Supreme Court says that federal courts should not be involved in deciding issues of gerrymandering, that those are political questions. All of this has allowed for anti-democratic, anti-democracy measures being put in place that have a disproportionate impact on people of color. And you couple that, as we say in the book, with the theft of 2 Supreme Court seats. Merrick Garland, never given a hearing, actually never given many interviews, 200 and something days before an election, but it was said that that's too close to the election. And then you go to Amy Coney Barrett, and she's placed on the court while people are voting. So those are 2 seats that could be in the hands of democratically appointed, or would have been made by democratically elected by Democrats. And that would have had a negative, that would have had a fundamentally different impact on a whole range of issues. Had Merrick Garland been on the court, we would have had a 5-4 progressive court for about 2-3 years. And a whole number of decisions, including the Shelby County case, might have been decided differently.
The other reason that the Shelby County decision was so outrageous is Congress had reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 3 different times, signed each time by Republican presidents. The last time in 2006, signed by George W. Bush after a 98-0 vote in the Senate, bringing together the likes of Addison, Mitchell McConnell, and Hillary Clinton. They both voted for it. And so it was a clear popular mandate. Based on that same evidence, 15,000 pages of evidence, the Supreme Court looked and said, we think America's changed, and we're not sure whether there's going to be a new wave of voter suppression. And then what the Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in the dissent was saying that we don't need pre-clearance because there's not voter suppression right now is like being in the middle of a rainstorm, having an umbrella and throwing it out because you're not getting wet. She understood that the reason that America had changed, the reason there had been progress, the reason our democracy had become a democracy was because of the Voting Rights Act. And the Supreme Court decided to test it. And it's not like it was some kind of a mystery. Literally the next week, that day, Greg Abbott tweeted, like, at Attorney General Eric Holder, basically like, ha ha, I'm going to go pass this bill. And then they just passed those bills and then methodically, surgically unwound all of the progress we'd made over decades. And the Supreme Court hasn't gone back and admitted they were wrong. In fact, Congress has not even gone back and reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in a new way with a new coverage formula. And so we're left without the protections and with the same insidious intent on behalf of Republicans, leaving our country and our democracy in complete shambles.
Yeah, and had the Voting Rights Act been in effect, a whole number of things might not have occurred. The use of these unnecessary photo ID laws that you have to show in some states in order to vote probably would not have been allowed by the Justice Department if it had an intact Voting Rights Act. The closure of polling places, of almost 1,800 polling places around the country, disproportionately in those places that were once covered by the Voting Rights Act, would probably not have been allowed. I mean, there's a whole range of things, and these have real impacts, and you have to understand, in this era of close elections, if you shave 1-2 percentage points off of, say, the African-American vote, the perceived Democratic vote, that can have a really dramatic impact on the outcome of elections. And one of the statistics, Sam, maybe we can talk about how long it takes to vote in Atlanta, or that number that we found in Atlanta.
Yeah, it was something like, I forget the exact number, but it was
Well,
something
I
closer.
remember it.
Do you remember it?
In the 2020 election, presidential election, if you came to Atlanta, a polling place, after 6 p.m., same day, on election day, and you were in an African-American precinct, it took you 51 minutes to vote on average. If you were in a white precinct in Atlanta, same day, same election, it took you 6 minutes to vote, And so that has a real impact. And so you wonder, well, why did the folks in Georgia pass this law that says you can't give food and water to people who wait in line? Because they knew damn well that the people who had to wait in line were people of color in Georgia. And they want to make it as difficult as is possible for people to simply get to the polls.
And I want to follow up on a point that you made. The Shelby County decision severely curtails the ability of the Justice Department to bring voting rights matters, but the department still has some role. Can you talk a little bit about the power that the department still has in ensuring people's right to vote across the country?
Yeah, watch the Supreme Court. Section 2 still remains, and that deals with the whole question of vote dilution and whether or not power can be exercised by communities, various communities. We won a case, that is the National Democratic Redistricting Committee won a case in Alabama with two appointed Trump judges who said, you know what, given the size of the African American population in Alabama, there should be a greater opportunity for that community to elect another congressperson of their choice. And throughout the maps that have been recently drawn by the Republican-dominated legislature, this happened this year, the United States Supreme Court said, well, too close to the election. We're going to not allow that change to occur, that redraw to occur. Vote on the maps that were put in place by the Republican legislature, which a federal court, right, two federal courts actually, found to be inappropriate, unconstitutional. So the votes that will happen in Alabama this year as a result of the Supreme Court's action are going to be, those elections will take place on these already found to be inappropriate maps. And here's my prediction. Section 2, this Alabama case will get to the Supreme Court, and this radicalized Supreme Court will do to Section 2, I fear, what it did to the other components of the Voting Rights Act, which could render the Voting Rights Act of 1965 almost a nullity. Now, it may not happen, and maybe I'm a doomsayer, but based on the way in which this court has dealt with election-related issues, and we talk about the young Chief Justice John Roberts and what he did when he was an attorney at the Justice Department, opposing a specific remedial measure there when the act was threatened a long time ago. But given that, given his history, given the other 5 justices who constitute that conservative portion of the court, Section 2 is at risk as well.
You've suggested term limits for Supreme Court justices in the past. Can you explain your thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, this is one, as we note in the book, where Chief Justice Roberts and former Attorney General Holder are on the same page. He said in a speech that we quote pretty extensively that Supreme Court justices should serve 15 years. I say 18 years. We go on to say that presidents should appoint Supreme Court justices, a justice in the first year of his or her term and in the third year of his or her term. And that way you have new people coming onto the court, new blood coming onto the court. And if you do an 18-year term, it would ultimately reduce the size of the court back down to 9. I also think we need to expand the court, given the fact that those 2 seats were stolen in the way that I described. I think that you want to have term limits because you point people now to the Supreme Court at age 50 or so. They had, I guess, the judge in Florida who, Judge Mizell, whatever her name is, she rendered an important decision just a little while ago. She's 33 years old, right? 33 years old, never tried a case. We haven't gone that far yet in the Supreme Court. But you can serve on the court now for 30 years, perhaps 40 years. That's too long for somebody to be in a position of power, in an unelected position of power, to have an impact on the direction of the nation. And so that's why I think, in addition to all the other reasons why, a term limit of 18 years makes a great deal of sense.
And 2 things have also changed since our founding. So one is life expectancy, which has radically increased, obviously. So instead of Supreme Court justices serving 10, 15, 20 years, they serve decades and decades and decades. This means that they're able to strategically retire often. So they'll intentionally retire when someone with their same ideology is president. They used to often just die in office. And so there would be some stochasticity to who ended up getting to appoint them. Now they're pretty intentional about it, and so they're able to increase their own partisanship in that process. It also means that the stakes of each Supreme Court fight in the Senate are existential. And so you end up having these total wars each time someone's appointed, which diminishes trust in the court as an institution. And so if you made this process more standardized, less arbitrary, you made it so every president just appointed 2 justices each term. You made it so they each served 18 years. And by the way, the long-term effect of this, in the short term, we would increase the number of justices, but eventually, if you do the math, I don't know, I trusted his math, gets back to 9 justices, I think. And so then you end up having a similar court, but it has legitimacy in the eyes of the people. It's better for the Supreme Court justices who get to focus on actually ruling their cases instead of trying to politically time their retirements. And it's obviously better for the American people who, once again, can have trust in the highest court in the land. And so it's a pretty no-brainer situation. At different points, different parties have been in favor of these reforms. It's just a question of actually doing it. 70% of Americans are in favor of term limits for Supreme Court justices, even now, even when it would advantage Republicans to leave the status quo in place. So it's a no-brainer. It just has to happen.
On the legislative front, what do you see as obstacles to getting voting rights legislation through Congress? And how do you go about then protecting voting rights in this country?
Well, I mean, I think the problem with getting voting rights legislation through, both at the federal level and at the state level, is that in a lot of, this is all about power. This is all about power. Who has power, who's willing to give up power. And so to go to a Republican-dominated state legislature and say, we need to put reforms in place that's probably going to decrease your power. The prime directive for politicians is to get reelected. So there's a problem there. And to be fair, if you go to a blue state and say to a Democratic-controlled state legislature, we want you to put in place measures that will decrease your power. They pull back on that as well. At the federal level, with the thin majority that the Democrats have, we were unable to pass legislation that would have ameliorated a lot of the things that we talk about in the book. It was a disappointing thing to see two Democratic senators not think that the filibuster, or not think that voting rights legislation was more important than the preservation of the filibuster. And so Senators Sinema and Manchin, I think, deserve some criticism there. But I think people who are getting a pass here are those 50 Republicans who voted as a bloc to say we're not going to be in favor of making changes that will make the nation more pro-democracy, and we want to maintain a status quo where we have, gerrymandering deciding too often either who controls the United States House of Representatives or what the margins are. I mean, Democrats won about 5 million more votes than Republicans in the last election for the United States House of Representatives and have a margin of about 5 or 6 seats. I don't know, after the last redistricting, Democrats won 1.4 million more votes as in 2012, 1.4 million more votes than Republicans, and were in a 33-seat deficit, even though they got more votes. That kind of stuff, as Sam was saying, that kind of gerrymandering leads to inaction because what you're concerned about more is a primary than a general election. You don't want to be seen as cooperating with people on the opposing party because that's seen as a sign of weakness and invites a primary challenger. It results in nothing being done, which then results in cynicism bred in the American people. We see obvious problems, we see obvious solutions, we see majority support for those solutions, and then nothing ever happens, Nothing ever happens. And that is why people have such a low regard for our governmental system, right now.
And, the Senate itself is built to be minoritarian and doesn't represent the American people in the slightest. I mean, right now there's 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans in the Senate. Democrats won 40 million more votes for the same number of seats. And that's just fundamentally, to anyone who understands anything about democracy, undemocratic. And this is the design of the Senate, obviously the Great Compromise, Constitutional Convention. But at that time, the state with the most number of people had 8 times more than people than the state with the least number of people. Now it's like 60. So if you're someone in North Dakota or Wyoming or one of these other small states, you have like 60 times more of a say in what happens in the Senate than if you were from California. And so you look at that and you wonder, like, why on earth do these things that the majority of Americans support not become laws? And it's because fundamentally that's not how the institution is designed, and those who are in power don't want to change it definitionally. And so it's about actually taking real risks and first getting rid of the filibuster, which this stat's mind-boggling. So if the 40 senators from the least populous states decided to hold up a bill supported by 59 other senators or 60 other senators, they could be 18% of the population. So you could have a situation where 82% of the public is in support of something, and 18% is able to stop it from happening. So you got to get rid of the filibuster first and foremost, but then you got to make DC and Puerto Rico states. You've got to do all of the work of making the Senate an actually representative institution, because otherwise we're obviously going to be playing from behind and having to make all sorts of compromises because we're dealing with an institution that's just fundamentally not aligned with the values of democracy.
Yeah, and that's not likely to change. I mean, the structure of the Senate is not likely to change. It would require a constitutional amendment that will never pass. That's just not going to pass. It is part of the great compromise, and we have the Senate as it is. Our proposal is that you admit Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico as states. Washington, D.C. has a greater population than 2 states. Puerto Rico, I think, has a greater population than 21 states. You know, I'm a resident of Washington, D.C. I pay federal taxes. We send our sons and daughters off to war. We're good citizens, and yet we do not have representation in Congress. And so that's at least one of the ways in which we think you could rebalance the Senate. Though I have to say, you know, everybody just assumes, well, you know, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., they will automatically send Democrats to the Senate. That's not necessarily true, certainly in Puerto Rico, where on a island-wide basis, Republicans have won, and Republicans have won here in Washington, D.C. as well. But at least that's an opportunity. It's a possibility of doing something with the Senate that otherwise is probably pretty impermeable to change.
In a highly polarized country, how do you convince people who are not imperiled by this to care about voting rights, or those who have the most to lose from fair voting rights to care?
I mean, I think it requires leadership and talking about these issues. I mean, there's a great many things that the American people have to deal with. In a 24/7 news cycle, we're concerned about, you know, prison guards helping, you know, somebody escape, you know, and having romantic relationships. I mean, okay, well, whatever. And there's a whole range of issues that get thrown at us, and we don't devote nearly enough time to, I think, that which maybe matters the most, and that's the state of our democracy. We need to talk about it more. Our leaders need to put these issues front and center. You know, as a proud Democrat, I think that's one of the issues that we should be running on. You know, certainly let's talk about the progress that the Biden administration made in dealing with the pandemic, bringing the economy back, but let's also run on democracy. Let's run on democracy. You know, where do you all where do you stand on partisan gerrymandering? You know, yeah, people's eyes glaze over gerrymandering. Eric, what are you talking about? Well, if you care about a woman's right to choose, if you care about criminal justice reform, if you care about climate, if you care about election protection, all of that stuff is directly related, as Sam said before, to gerrymandering, you know? And so educate the American people about these pro-democracy issues. I actually think they are winning issues. I think the American people are ready for the kind of change that we talk about in the book. I think there has been a failure in this country by those who have led us to ask the American people to face, you know, some tough issues and be prepared to come up with some hard answers. I still think we have it within us to do these kinds of things, if we can put them before the American people.
And you know, the question of how do you get people to care, this has been a question since the very beginning of the voting rights struggle. And the answer is that you have to make them care. Like, those in power have never wanted to relinquish the monopoly on power that they have. And then, you know, in Rhode Island, where white men couldn't vote at the end of the 19th century, Thomas Dorr, Seth Luther, they led this rebellion. They were literally bombing the Capitol for voting rights. Dorr's family was there. I'm not saying anyone should bomb the Capitol.
We're not saying bomb the Capitol.
That's the other side.
No.
But what then happens is you then look at, you know, in Reconstruction, civil rights movement, women's suffrage movement, you know, you had Alice Paul outside the White House every single day protesting. She gets arrested for protesting, then refuses to eat, has to be fed through a feeding tube in prison for a women's right to have a vote. And then you look at the civil rights movement, obviously everyone knows the struggle and resistance that went into that. But it's not like this is something that's ever come easily. Those in power have always wanted to maintain it. And we actually have more of a voice now, we have a vote now, we have resources now than we've ever had before to lead this fight. So, I mean, you know, as much as anyone, some days I want to resort to pessimism and just throw in the towel. But like you look at the history of this country, we are the best equipped of any of those people to actually realize the promise of our democracy. And so it's just a question of whether we'll have that will, whether we'll still fight like those past generations have fought, imperfect as they were, methods as suspect as their methods were. We need to actually take that same urgency and go campaign on it in the way that they have with real resistance. Because otherwise, obviously, power begets power, and it seeds nothing without a demand, as Frederick Douglass said.
Yeah, and this is an issue that we've confronted as a nation since we were a nation. I mean, we talk about what happened in Rhode Island, as Sam was saying. White men without property could not vote. And Doar said, you know, this guy Seth Luther, they said, no, well, that's just wrong. And so again, they resorted to the bombing and all that stuff. But ultimately, you know, white men without property had the right to vote. Women were denied the right to vote. That change didn't happen because it was time. It happened because people like Alice Paul, Ida B. Wells, you know, decided that they're going to do something to make sure that this happens. There was a march in 1913 where women marched for the right to vote. They were beaten here in Washington, D.C. They were beaten for trying to protest for those rights. You know, our system of political apartheid didn't end because its time was up. It was because people like Dr. Martin Luther King, those 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, you know, in Mississippi, gave their lives. Other people, you know, sacrificed. We talk about, you know, Cage Lee, Eddie Lee Jackson. I mean, people, you know, in the South who sacrificed. Medgar Evers. You know, you think about all these people and what they faced to make the progress that we now enjoy. And so your question is a good one. Are we willing to make the sacrifices that they did? We will not face what Medgar Evers faced. You know, there are not going to be people shooting at you. You won't have to put your life on the line. Yeah, there are crazies out there. But, you know, the stakes are not as high. The physical stakes are not as high. The stakes for our democracy are just as great now as they were back then. So I think leadership and the involvement of the American people, the history that we outline shows that if you get a committed American citizenry, you can make fundamental change. So anybody who tells you that, you know, Sam and Eric, they're just wrong, none of this stuff can happen, that's wrong. If we work hard enough for it, if we commit ourselves to it, the kinds of changes that we're talking about are indeed possible.
You both have mentioned this case. So one of the most watched pending redistricting cases now is Castor v. Merrill out of Alabama, the case involving obviously a claim that a new congressional district map approved by the legislature unlawfully dilutes the voting power of the state's black communities. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear that case next fall, but in the meantime is allowing the state to hold the 2022 election using the map that's being challenged in that suit. General, you've called that an ideological abuse of the court's power. Can you bring us up to speed on that case, which many in the room may not have heard of, and explain why you think the High Court got this wrong?
Well, as I said before, so I'll be pretty brief. You know, Alabama's black population is, I think, 27%. If you look at the number of congressmen that they have, and figure out, well, you know, who ought to have the ability to choose their representatives, and you can, the way in which the lines are drawn. African Americans are packed in such a way that all the power that African Americans have can be expressed in that one district. But if you geographically just kind of draw the lines in a sane way, you'd end up with probably 2 African American districts, or 2 districts where an African American would be likely to win. Again, he brought this lawsuit in Alabama, and we won before a single judge, and then we also won before a special court that was comprised of 3 judges, 2 of whom, again, had been appointed by President Trump. Those 4 judges all said, you know, yeah, that makes a good point, that the lines that were drawn have been done so inappropriately. Supreme Court simply had to there was plenty of time to redraw the lines. You know, redrawing the lines after you've had a whole number of maps, you know, proposed doesn't take an awful long time. And so they could have redrawn the lines, redone the ballots, and done the primaries and everything like that. Supreme Court steps in and says, nope, it's too close to the election. Really? Okay. So as I said, what you're going to do in Alabama is have an election on maps that 4 judges have said are unconstitutional and that are going to deprive African Americans of their ability to really exercise their power. And as I said, the thing that concerns me is they're going to use this as a vehicle to get at Section 2, which is the basis of the lawsuit. They're going to say that Section 2 is a race-driven component of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In fact, Ron DeSantis has already kind of stumbled into that in a way that only he can. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. And I think the court is likely to use this case as a way to get at Section 2 of the act as well.
And just to follow up on that, in light of last week's leak of the preliminary vote, the preliminary opinion in Roe v. That ultimately, could strike down Roe v. Wade, do you see the Alabama case as another piece of evidence suggesting this newer conservative-leaning Supreme Court may peel away more perceived and presumed civil rights one after another?
Sure. I mean, I think I don't think we're going to see that opinion, the language of that opinion, survive. I mean, it's caustic, it's overheated, it's unnecessary, it doesn't hold up logically or legally. So, but I think you're more likely than not to see the overall decision, which is to overrule Roe versus Wade, survive. And the way they do that is to say that they attack the right to privacy. They tried now. Justice Alito then says, "What we're doing this to Roe versus Wade, but we're not doing this to a whole bunch of other places." Other rights that the American people have. But once you've done it, the genie's out the bottle, and so, same-sex marriage, contraception. And you're already starting to see this in some state legislatures, talking about, well, we ought to be able to legislate whether or not unmarried people have the ability to use contraceptives. You think about this stuff, the possibility of interracial marriage. Again, that's all based on the notion of the right to privacy. That individuals have the right to privacy. The government should not interfere. This decision, which I think, as I said, is likely to occur, will have a huge collateral impact on a whole range of rights, not all of which will be expressed by the federal government, but in these gerrymandered state legislatures, now free of, or having a weakened right to privacy, will do a whole range of crazy-ass things that will not be supported by the majority of the people in those states, but because you've got gerrymandered state legislatures, they will try to put them into effect. And I don't remember exactly what state was, but I read about it. I have one in mind, but I don't want to say the state because I don't want to cast aspersions on it in an inaccurate way. But I know that there's already conversation about dealing with the notion of contraception in unmarried couples. And you think about that. I mean, is this where we are potentially going?
Claims of voter fraud in a rigged 2020 election, obviously disputed by dozens of judges, election officials, and President Trump's former Attorney General himself, have shaken voter confidence nevertheless. This could influence the perception of our voting system for years and election cycles to come. What do you suggest state and federal government officials do to boost confidence in our democracy?
Well, I think, I assume we have lots of people in the media here. One of the things we have to do is that the media, and I'm not being critical here, but the media needs to call out all of these inaccuracies. The notion that the election that we just held, in the presidential election in 2020, was in any ways rigged, inaccurate, false, tampered with, is nonsense. It's just nonsense. And I think it's the responsibility of the press. If I say, it's raining outside, and my Republican colleague says, it's not raining outside, the media shouldn't report, well, the Democrats said it was raining, the Republicans said it wasn't raining. The media ought to tell us, was it raining outside? And so there needs to be an analysis or analyses done. And it's been done, I think in a lot of ways and in a lot of media circles. But anytime there is a report or a claim by somebody about what happened in the 2020 election, there has to be a factual rejoinder to it. So I think that's where we have to start. Then, I think we have to get in touch with the American people through the political process and push back against what Republicans, too many Republicans, are saying about what happened in 2020, and then using what happened or did not happen in 2020 as a basis for further voter restrictions. I mean, you know, Texas, maybe the hardest state in which to vote, Georgia, a real hard state to vote. They weren't satisfied with what happened in 2020. Texans, Republicans did pretty well in Texas. Democrats did pretty well in Georgia. They've introduced more restrictions after the election in 2020, all based on the notion, this fanciful notion that there was widespread voter fraud, of which there's absolutely no statistical proof. Zero, nada, cero. It does not exist, and we have to keep saying that.
And Sam, you talked a little bit about this earlier, but if we don't make progress on voting rights in the United States, what difference do you think that makes in this country in 50 or 100 years from now?
Right. I mean, if I pretended to know what's going on in 50 or 100 years, that would be a sign of worse things for me. But I mean, I think fundamentally, if you look at the margins that these elections are decided by, as the Attorney General said, if you'd have had 3% lower African-American turnout in Georgia in 2020, the election gets flipped. So you look at how tight these margins are and what we're relying on. So even these small attempts to suppress the vote at the margins make massive differences. I mean, so much of the country's future hinged on the 2000 decision in Bush v. Gore, which was an election decided by a few hundred votes. That election, there were many more voters purged from the rolls inaccurately than the margin of the election. So that's an example where literally the entire last 25 years of our country's existence might have been completely different had there not been voter purges. And since then, this stuff has all been in complete overdrive. But to get at that question about like how do we restore faith in elections, I mean, it's kind of like, if Republicans ask it, it's kind of like an arsonist who burns down your home being like, all right, how are we going to improve home fire safety? Like, the Republicans are trying to solve a problem that they created. And then the media asks questions like, how do we go about restoring faith in the election? It's like, I don't know, maybe like if Republicans didn't work specifically, intentionally, methodically to destroy trust in elections, and maybe if it weren't framed as Democrats and Republicans dispute whether it's raining outside, maybe then we wouldn't need to deal with this problem in the first place. And so I think putting the onus on the folks who are accurately describing the state of our democracy, which is that we do have fair elections, which is that you're more likely to be struck by lightning. We're really doing a lot of metaphors having to do with weather. That you're more likely to be struck by lightning than show up in person and commit voter fraud. Like, if you actually just look at the situation on the ground, like the folks who are telling the truth shouldn't be the ones who have to prove to the country that this thing is above board. And I think that that's a fundamental demonstration of how our democracy is falling apart while everyone sort of shrugs and says, what could we possibly do about it?
Yeah, we talked about this in the writing of the book. The big lie. That's what this is. It's the big lie, and it's had its desired impact. And we talked about the origins supposedly of the big lie. It happened in a European country in the 20th century. You think, well, how far do we go with this? Because you never want to compare anybody or anything in this country with the German experience in the 20th century. And yet, that notion of the big lie and what Joseph Goebbels said about, how the impact of the big lie is something that we have to counteract. Now, we got to understand also, Lincoln said you can fool some of the people all of the time, all right, and that's going to happen. I read one study, like 20% of the people think that the moon landing didn't occur. All right, there's a certain number of people we're not going to reach. There's a whole bunch of people, however, who, if confronted with facts, consistently confronted with facts, will actually, change their minds. But it's going to take a process. And when you've got a news channel, Fox News, that really kind of spouts a lot of this stuff, and that a lot of people are using that as the sole place from which they get their news, that's a problem that we didn't have to confront, say, during the Watergate years. I mean, I really wonder, given what Nixon did, far less serious than what Trump and his cohorts did with regard to trying to stop the peaceful transition of power. If Fox existed during the Watergate years, I wonder whether or not he would have been whether he'd been forced to resign. I'm really not sure.
And by the way, if Fox Media characterized voter fraud the way you did, as disputed by judges, federal, local, over and over and over again, disputed by his own attorney general, I think our country would be in a radically different place. And the fact that it's never caveated that way in most settings is, I think, a huge detriment to our democracy and to the people who deserve to have real information to make as the basis of the choices that they make at the polls.
So, General, this afternoon, the January 6th committee subpoenaed Kevin McCarthy, Andy Biggs, and several other Republicans. Do you believe that they should cooperate with the committee's inquiry? And if they don't, do you believe the Justice Department has a role in bringing criminal charges for contempt or failing to cooperate with that inquiry?
Yeah, I think the committee conducted itself in an appropriate way. They sought voluntary cooperation. Basically, got the Heisman. They said, no, we're not going to interact with you. And I think that they did the necessary thing, which was to issue these subpoenas. Now, this has happened before, as I understand it. House Ethics Committee has done this before, so there is some precedent for it. I'm sure that this will end up in a lawsuit of some sort. My hope would be that the court here in the District of Columbia that hears the case will do so on an expedited basis, and so that we actually hear from the people who have been subpoenaed. But I think the question that the American people ought to ask themselves, of the 5, 6 people who were subpoenaed, is why aren't you talking to the January 6th committee? What are you trying to hide? Kevin McCarthy, you said an awful lot of stuff. You were talking a lot of smack. Immediately after the election, that you seem to have changed after you took the trip down to Mar-a-Lago. Well, what's the truth? You held President Trump accountable for what happened on January the 6th, or you're saying this is something that was overblown and these were just peaceful protesters. Why are you afraid of talking to the January 6th committee? Why are you afraid of talking to the American people about this? And the same thing I would ask of all the other people who have been subpoenaed. And for those people who are going to be voting in those districts in November, that would be, for me, a really important thing. Why isn't my congressman cooperating with the January 6th committee? What does my congressman have to hide? What does my congressman not want to share? What is my congressman afraid of? So, we'll see what happens.
And just before we conclude, because we're getting to time here and get to the final question, let me just take a moment to thank headliners, co-team leaders, Donna Line-Wan-Lachey and Lori Russo, as well as Club Membership Director Kate Helster and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. I'd also obviously like to thank General Holder and Mr. Koppelman for being with us here today and present you both with these National Press Club mugs as an appreciation for your time. And with that, let's get to the final question, another one from the audience. General, are you disheartened by the slow pace in which the Department of Justice has been handling referrals from the House Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection? And if you were Attorney General now, would you be pursuing these referrals for criminal act with greater speed than General Garland?
I don't have insight into all that's happening in the Justice Department. But I think it's pretty significant that they moved pretty quickly on Bannon. Meadows, nothing's going on there, and for an extended period of time. I have great trust in Attorney General Garland, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, the Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. There's something going on there. That's not inattention or lack of guts. There's something going on with regard to their failure to do something in that regard. I don't know all that the Justice Department is or is not doing with regard to the January the 6th investigation. But again, I have faith in their abilities. And the Attorney General, having served, is in a tough position because the tradition of the Justice Department is you don't talk about ongoing investigations, and the law says that you cannot talk about grand jury investigations. Those have to be done in secret. So we don't know all that the Justice Department is doing. Now, having said that, I do think that there is an educational component that the department has a responsibility to do. It would not be a good thing for the Attorney General to walk up to the 7th floor, that's where the press conferences happen in the Justice Department, go up to the 7th floor of the Justice Department and announce the case of the United States versus Donald Trump. and just spring that on the nation. That would, there needs to be some way to let the American people know what the department is about, how the investigation, to the extent that it's going, is. And there are ways in which it can be done. And so I think that's a place where, if I were giving some advice, and I'm sure, I guess they'll be reading this, if I was giving some advice to the department, I would say that maybe they could do things in a little different way. But I really want to kind of defend them. There's a lot of criticism of the department, all of which will be forgotten if indictments are returned. No one will remember the fact that they got excoriated over the course of some number of months. If they indict a few people or the ultimate person, then that'll all be forgotten. But I think they're doing things in the right way. And I'd also point to what the Attorney General said in his speech, I guess, on January the 6th, which is they would hold all people accountable at any level, at any level. I know Merrick Garland. He's a judge. He's a precisionist when it comes to language. And I know that speech was vetted, in a whole bunch of ways. And for him to say at any level is something that is extremely significant. So I think, let's hold off on criticizing DOJ, and let's see what they ultimately do.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here, and thanks to all of you for attending as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gotta get me one of those mugs.
There you go. Don't
Yeah.
give Sam his mug now.